So before we begin, let's explain some symbols that we'll be using in this presentation. So these M&Ms will represent electrons. This pyruvate acid or pyruvate will be represented by these kidney beans. Carbon will be represented by the plentiful rice because there's lots and lots of carbon. And the ATP, which is energy, will be represented by these chickpeas. And finally, carbs or sugars will be represented by actual sugar. Let's talk a bit about glycolysis. So chemoautoheterotrophs undergo glycolysis. Glycolysis is a function that is used by both respiration and fermentation. Glycolysis is a catabolic process which is used to harvest energy in the form of ATP, electrons, and carbon. One important point about glycolysis is that it does not require oxygen. So now we will talk about how the process of glycolysis actually works. So it breaks down sugar. So let's take some sugar. We'll take some sugar and we'll put it on this whiteboard here for everyone to see. So the first step in glycolysis is that it breaks down sugar. So now how does this break down the sugar? Basically you have this glucose. Sugar is glucose or carbohydrates. And it requires energy. So let's just take 2 ATPs and let's input it here. So carbons are formed along the way. And this continues to, there's a long process. So in summary, this continues. And then finally, what you're produced with is 4 ATP. So we'll take 4 of these. So you're using 2 and you're producing 4. So that means total, the net equals 2. So you're producing 2. So along with ATP, you're also producing electrons. And finally, along with producing ATP, electrons, you are producing pyruvate acid, which is right here. And this acid, pyruvic acid, is toxic to cells. Now, let's move on to respiration. First of all, what is respiration? Respiration is the process of collecting energy in the form of ATP and collecting carbon, shown here by these symbols. These two are collected by a catabolic reaction. Respiration only comes into play after glycolysis has been completed. Respiration is there to take care of the pyruvic acid or pyruvate that has been formed due to glycolysis. The pyruvic acid goes through the Krebs cycle, which produces many electrons and ATP. So the electrons that are produced from the Krebs cycle are then passed through the electron transport chain or electron transport system. So now, after the electrons pass through the electron transport system or electron transport cycle, they meet ATP synthase, and this enzyme, the ATP synthase, converts these electrons into ATPs, hence energy. So lots and lots of ATP is formed from this, from the electron transport system. Now, what happens when the electrons get full? So as you can see, these electrons there's many electrons. This is, again, to remind, this is aerobic respiration, which means that you breathe in oxygen. So humans and animals breathe in oxygen to get rid of these electrons that are excess or they've stopped in the electron transport system. So oxygen comes into play. So O2, oxygen comes into the electron transport system. And what it does is that it meets with hydrogen to form H2O, which is known as the water we have right here. So this H2O is formed, and H2O is very easy to get rid of in humans and animals. So just to conclude, the end products of of aerobic respiration is lots and lots of ATP and lots of water, and also carbon dioxide, which is found in the atmosphere.
Let's talk a bit about fermentation. So fermentation takes care of the pyruvic acid, which is the toxic acid formed from glycolysis. In comparison to respiration, fermentation is a very different process, and it produces much less ATP as compared to respiration. Fermentation requires no oxygen, so anaerobic microorganisms prefer fermentation over respiration. Fermentation is very different because it produces lactic acid and alcohol, hence the two different forms of fermentation. Lactic fermentation, which is used to produce lactate, and alcohol fermentation, which is used to produce alcohol, such as ethanol. Lactic fermentation is also useful today because it is used to produce different things, such as milk and yogurt, which is shown right here. Some of the main key differences in fermentation is that it does not use the Krebs cycle. So fermentation also requires no electron transport chain, no proton motive force, and it also doesn't require any ATP synthase. So in summary, fewer ATP molecules are produced in fermentation as compared to respiration. So it is more inefficient in producing energy, and it produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct.